It all started with one. News spread of a flying man attacking people. At first, only criminals were attacked. Then, more of them came, calling themselves adjudicators. Welcome to Hardline. Hardline is a single-player narrative adventure game. It includes third-person action and map-based grand strategy elements. This world is ruled by an alien race who proclaimed themselves judge, jury, and executioner. To manage the populace, morality tracking chips were implanted in all citizens and strict laws were implemented. These chips provide a visible gauge to the player and show how close to a critical infraction level they are. This system only pertains to societal laws as enforced by the adjudicators. Committing too many actions that go against the new rule of law, regardless of moral intent, will trigger the chip and draw the attention of the local adjudicator. They will attempt to hunt down the player and mete out justice, potentially causing the player to receive a game over. The player will experience this alien police state in which they will feel isolated, as cities are divided by checkpoints and other barriers that limit the player map. Throughout these cities, the player will encounter several factions, each with their own personality and code. Sympathizers, who mostly chose to embrace the adjudicators and their laws. The bystanders, who did not embrace the adjudicators but chose to stay in the cities despite the circumstances. The isolationists have chosen to leave the cities and live in seclusion. The opportunists are those who seek to profit from the weakness of others, be they human or not. The defiants are those who resent their new overlords, they seek to rebel and take back what was lost. And finally, the subverters, a small group of adjudicators who do not agree with how their kind has subjugated humanity. Together, they form a trading network which allows them to circumvent the strictest of rules. They trade for basic commodities like food, clothing, information, and even weaponry. This network can appear as a physical location in a rotating series of areas the player can access. The player will find important characters, obtain missions, trade resources, and utilize diplomacy. Each faction has conflicts of interest that will affect the story. For example, sympathizers will never knowingly work with someone who openly associates themselves with the Defiants. Progressing through the story, the player will have to gain favor with the factions and their members. Favor is a numerical value associated with each faction. The player can manipulate their favor value with each faction by completing objectives given to them by any faction member. The favor scale runs from 0 to 100 with each faction starting at 50. Aesthetics and architecture will be used to communicate information about the game world to players. Sympathizers are allowed to live in relatively well-outfitted homes, while Defiants operate out of hidden bases reminiscent of speakeasies. We have chosen to use a harsh, realistic art style with a near-future cityscape aesthetic. This includes aspects of cyberpunk, such as genetic and cybernetic modifications, as well as modern dystopian visuals. Boarded-up windows and doors are a common sight, along with hidden safe havens for those most affected by the invasion. Hardline will feature scripted weather events that will alter the player's understanding of the city around them. An area that looks beautiful and pristine in the sunshine may suddenly become dreary as displaced populations use it for shelter in a thunderstorm. Humans aren't the only ones affected by the invasion. Domesticated animals are a common sight in this world, but they may be less than familiar. Cybernetically enhanced canines roam the streets, used by the adjudicators to monitor low-level crime. The introduction of alien technology in agriculture has accelerated genetic modification at an alarming rate. Everyday livestock, such as cows and pigs, are only barely recognizable to players. Ultimately, we want players to experience a world that reminds them of a twisted version of their own. This experience will be further bolstered by the use of sound. Everywhere the player goes, they will be able to hear ambient sound from weather and their environment, as well as indications of who they are near. For instance, in areas that are controlled and monitored by the adjudicators, broadcast messages will tell the player about the state of the world and potentially new laws brought about due to their actions. The sound effects will be provided through creative Foley work in an effort to maintain the familiar-unfamiliar aesthetic. The cyborg dogs will feature heavily modified recordings of real dogs to match with the alien technology that created them. The use of unconventional audio techniques will create a distinctly inhuman sound for any alien technology. The soundtrack for Hardline will include music from several genres to reflect the personalities and values of each faction. The sympathizers listen to music that resembles a warped version of modern trap, which they believe to be music from the adjudicator homeworld. In actuality, this genre was invented by the opportunists to capitalize on this fad. The opportunists themselves listened to power metal, with lyrics often promoting personal choice and a life outside of the public consciousness. Defiance chose to adopt an off-the-grid culture with DIY ska and punk music. This reflects their anti-establishment ideals and penchant for activism through necessary violence. The game is heavily dependent on conversation and environmental sounds. It includes several accessibility options, a robust subtitle system, options for font size, shadows, and dyslexia-friendly fonts. Additionally, the game ships with shader options to make the world accessible to players with color blindness and controller or keyboard mapping for players with motor function disabilities. In this world, players will be able to create a fully customizable character. They can change their appearance, select a background, and modify their attributes. The player's appearance can be altered in several ways, including facial details, body shape, skin tone, and gender identity. Backgrounds will determine the starting values of their 3 core attributes: body, mind, and heart. High attributes may even allow them to access more dialogue options in the right circumstances. The body attribute influences physical actions such as the player's ability to persuade their opponents through intimidation. The mind attribute governs knowledge-related actions such as using science to resolve a problem. Finally, the heart attribute influences the player's interpersonal actions, the ability to persuade someone in a moment of extreme emotion or remain composed in a high-stakes dispute. A player will be able to increase attributes or favor by successfully completing optional minigames, succeeding in diplomacy, completing dynamic events, or interacting with other characters. These interactions can be as simple as a conversation or as complex as a series of tasks. Important characters will have a vast dialogue tree. All decisions that the player makes through these conversations will affect how the world develops and reacts to them. For example, if the player chooses to confess to the existence of a defiant agent, they will lose a lot of favor with the defiants, but will gain that same amount of favor for the sympathizers, bringing the player closer to their ending. Hardline will feature multiple endings. As the player makes choices, their decisions will bring them closer to one of those endings. One person can't change the world alone. To find success, the player will need to join forces with one of the factions by reaching maximum favor with them. The player will then join that faction and help them achieve their ultimate goal, ending the game. As an example, maxing out favor with the Defiants causes an uprising that dethrones the local adjudicator, causing a ripple effect as rebellions rise in nearby cities. Gaining maximum favor with the Opportunists will lead to a power shift that sees all the real authority fall into the hands of those in the underground. Taking the side of the Sympathizers, however, will initiate a cultural takeover, leaving everyone in the city in a state of near warship towards the Adjudicators. Hardline will be available on PC, Xbox, and PlayStation consoles. In conclusion, Hardline is a single-player narrative adventure game. It features factions, moral choices, and a vast dialogue tree. It also includes minigames, multiple endings, thematic art and music, and accessibility options. Thank you for your time.